Friends, thank you for being here today. For decades, there has been an unspoken, almost gravitational rule governing the geopolitical reality of North America. When Washington sneezes, Ottawa catches a cold. It was an accepted axiom of our shared geography and intertwined economies that the United States dictated the economic weather, and Canada simply bought a heavier coat. But over the last 18 months, we have borne witness to the definitive, historic collapse of that old paradigm. We are no longer catching their cold. Instead, we are watching, with a profound and measured clarity, as the American economic engine feverishly attacks its own immune system. What we are examining today is not merely a trade dispute. It is not a routine diplomatic spat over softwood lumber or dairy quotas, the kinds of bureaucratic friction we have navigated since the days of the Auto Pact. What we are witnessing is a foundational rupture in the Canada-United States dynamic, triggered by an unprecedented and frankly reckless escalation of U.S. tariffs, from a punishing 25% to a staggering 45% on Canadian goods. This was designed by the White House as an absolute ultimatum. It was intended to be a shock and awe campaign of economic coercion meant to force an immediate Canadian capitulation. Instead, it has triggered something the architects of this policy never saw coming: Canada's long-overdue economic emancipation. Through measured statecraft, ruthless data-driven strategy, and an ironclad diplomatic discipline, Canada is not merely neutralizing American economic aggression. We are systematically exposing the fatal, self-destructive flaws in Washington's protectionist policies, and we are doing it on the world stage. This is a victory of intellect over emotion, of the rule of law over erratic populism. And it proves, once and for all, that a middle power does not need to shout to fundamentally shift the global balance of power. Now, to really grasp how we got to this boiling point, we have to look across the border and understand the sheer scale of the strategic miscalculation happening in Washington right now. When the current U.S. administration returned to power, it brought with it a perspective that was deeply detached from historical and economic reality. They viewed Canada not as America's closest ally, not as a vital partner who has stood shoulder to shoulder on every major battlefield since the First World War, but as a subordinate territory ripe for extraction. This culminated in the deeply insulting and fundamentally ignorant rhetoric referring to Canada as the 51st state. We saw altered maps treating our sovereign territory as an absorbed appendage of the American Republic. We saw the former Prime Minister addressed merely as a governor, a deliberate attempt to strip away the dignity of a sovereign G7 nation. Let me pause here and ask you, when you first heard that 51st state rhetoric coming out of Washington, what was your initial reaction? Did it feel like a standard political bluff, or did it cross a line for you? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, because I think that moment fundamentally changed how Canadians view our neighbors. But this 51st state delusion was not just insulting. It was a symptom of a profound analytical failure. It revealed a staggering ignorance of the Canadian psyche. We are a nation built by people who looked at the American Revolution and explicitly chose a different path, a path of peace, order, and good government, rather than upheaval and manifest destiny. Treating us as a subservient entity waiting to be bullied into submission is a misreading of history that borders on geopolitical malpractice. This psychological miscalculation immediately bled into economic lunacy. The weaponization of trade through blanket 35% to 45% tariffs is an indiscriminate attack on a highly integrated North American supply chain that took 3 generations to build. This is not about protecting an isolated American steel mill. This is about dropping a sledgehammer on the delicate, just-in-time manufacturing ecosystems that define modern industry. When an auto part crosses the Detroit-Windsor border 6 times before becoming a finished vehicle, a 45% tariff is not a tax on Canada. It is a punitive, compounding tax levied directly against the American manufacturer and the American consumer. More critically, this policy exposes a glaring blind spot in Washington's strategic vision: the absolute, undeniable reliance of the United States on Canadian resources. The U.S. administration's aggression operates on the obsolete assumption of Canadian dependency. They have conveniently ignored the fact that America's future its transition to a high-tech economy, and its national security apparatus, is entirely dependent on the Canadian shield. We provide the stable energy baseloads, the uranium, the hydroelectric power, and crucially, the critical minerals, the lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements that are the lifeblood of modern technology and defense systems. By attempting to place Canada under economic siege, Washington has essentially laid siege to its own resource base, isolating itself in a world where access to strategic materials is the new currency of global supremacy. And folks, it's exactly in the face of that American overreach where the brilliance of the Canadian response truly shines. When Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped up to the plate, he didn't just bring a new policy. He brought an entirely new mindset, what you might call an elbows-up approach to diplomacy. He brought a resume that fundamentally altered the intellectual weight class of bilateral negotiations. This is not a man who has spent his life trading political insults on social media. This is a former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. This is a man who has stared down the barrel of the 2008 global financial crisis and sat across the table from the most powerful, predatory financial minds on the planet without blinking. He understands the mechanics of global capital down to the marrow. His approach has been a masterclass in asymmetric diplomacy. Rather than meeting American bluster with Canadian outrage, Carney has employed diplomatic judo, using the immense, unregulated momentum of the opponent against them. He recognized that engaging in theatrical, populist shouting matches is exactly what the U.S. administration wanted. Instead, he deployed financial erudition, controlling the narrative through cold, undeniable reality. We saw this immediately during his first Oval Office meeting. It was a moment of profound strategic framing. By looking the U.S. president in the eye and utilizing the transactional, real estate language native to the American administration, Carney laid down an impenetrable boundary. As you know from real estate, he said, there are some places that are never for sale, and we're sitting in one right now. Canada is not for sale, won't be for sale ever. It was brilliant because it was intellectually disarming. The White House had no counter-argument because Carney had spoken their dialect, but used it to construct a fortress of Canadian sovereignty. He did not ask for respect. He simply stated an unalterable condition of the relationship. But the true genius of Canada's strategy unfolded not in Washington, but on the global stage, specifically in the contrasting events of the Davos World Economic Forum and the subsequent address at the Quebec Citadel. At Davos, Carney did the unthinkable. He bypassed Washington entirely and spoke directly to the global community. By declaring that the post-World War II order was experiencing a rupture, he accurately diagnosed the disease of American isolationism. But it was his rallying cry to the world's middle powers that shifted the tectonic plates of international relations. If we're not at the table, we're on the menu. It was a call for democratic nations to band together to insulate themselves from American unpredictability. The standing ovation he received was not just for his eloquence, it was the sound of global relief that someone, finally, had the intellectual courage to say the quiet part out loud. The U.S. administration's response the following day was entirely predictable, a reactive, emotional tantrum. Standing on the same stage, the U.S. president lashed out, declaring, "Canada lives because of the United States." It was a desperate attempt to reclaim dominance through pure arrogance. And how did Canada respond? Did we throw a tantrum? Did we match their aggression? No. Carney flew home to Quebec City and stood before the historic Citadel. For those who understand our history, the symbolism was deafening. The Citadel is a star fort, quite literally built in the 19th century to defend British North America against the threat of an American invasion. Standing with the literal and metaphorical weight of Canadian defensive history behind him, Carney delivered a chillingly calm, fatal blow to American populism. "Canada does not live because of the United States," he stated with absolute precision. "Canada thrives because we are Canadian." He went further, methodically dissecting the ideology of America first. In a time of rising populism and ethnic nationalism, Canada can show how diversity is a strength, not a weakness. Nostalgia is not a strategy. In 5 words, He intellectually dismissed the entire political brand of the American administration. He reframed Canadian diversity, our adherence to the rule of law, and our institutional stability not as polite Canadian traits, but as superior geopolitical assets. He demonstrated that true strength does not require shouting. It requires the quiet, unshakable confidence of a nation that knows exactly who it is and what it is worth. But let's step away from the podiums for a second, because while the diplomacy has been a masterclass, the real proof of Canada's strategy is in the hard math of the economic fallout. The U.S. administration intended these tariffs to break the Canadian economy. Instead, we are witnessing an economic boomerang of spectacular proportions, resulting in deeply self-inflicted wounds across the American heartland. Protectionism, stripped of its political marketing, is simply a domestic consumption tax, and the American working class is paying it in full. Let us look at the data, unvarnished and real. In the wake of these 45% tariffs, we are seeing the American economy stagger under the weight of its own policies. U.S. gas prices are surging. Oil has violently crossed the $100 a barrel threshold. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, long the favored barometer of the U.S. administration's success, has experienced terrifying 5% slides. Most damning of all, unemployment among U.S.-born workers has actually increased, climbing from 4.4% to 4.7% over the past 12 months. The promise was a roaring, insulated American economy. The reality is supply chain strangulation. The tariffs meant to punish Canadian producers have simply driven up the cost of raw materials for American manufacturers, forcing them to pass those costs onto consumers or cut jobs. The U.S. administration built a wall and forgot that they locked themselves inside with the rising water. I'm curious to hear from those of you watching. Do you think the American public is starting to realize that these tariffs are actually a self-inflicted wound? Drop your perspective in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I think it's a crucial part of this discussion. Nowhere is the incoherence of U.S. policy more glaringly obvious than in the saga of the Gordie Howe International Bridge. This is the ultimate case study in the difference between serious governance and political grandstanding. The U.S. president threatened to block the opening of a bridge that handles 25% of all bilateral trade, a bridge that Canada paid over $4 billion to build, a bridge that was constructed using American steel, employing American workers to facilitate the very trade that keeps the Detroit auto industry alive. To threaten the severing of this logistical artery over a fabricated grievance regarding ownership is an act of economic self-mutilation. It is the policy equivalent of cutting off your own hand to spite your neighbor. And again, observe the Canadian response. There was no panic. There were no retaliatory threats to shut down the border. There was only calm, measured, factual dismantling of the American narrative. Prime Minister Carney simply picked up the phone, explained the facts, reminded the White House that the bridge was fast-tracked during their own previous term, and moved on. Calm, measured, factual, not rattled, not intimidated, just steady. That is the sound of adults remaining in the room while the children break the furniture. And because we've held our ground so steadily, we've been able to pull off something far bigger than just playing defense. We are living through a great decoupling, folks. Canada is fundamentally realigning its place in the global economic order, and we aren't looking back. For a century, our economic strategy has been predicated on preferred access to the American market. It was a comfortable, if sometimes precarious, arrangement. But the 45% tariff ultimatum shattered the illusion of American reliability. In doing so, Washington inadvertently cured Canada of its over-reliance on the United States. We are no longer hiding under the increasingly leaky American security umbrella. We are stepping out and stepping up. We are actively executing the mandate laid out at Davos, acting as the convener of democratic middle powers. We are looking to Australia, to Japan, to the European Union, to India. The execution of this pivot has been breathtaking in its speed and efficiency. In just 6 months, Canada struck 12 new major trade deals across 4 continents. We are aggressively moving our agricultural products, our advanced manufacturing, and our critical minerals to markets that respect contracts and the rule of law. The data confirms this historic shift. Canada's share of goods exported to the United States has violently dropped to the lowest levels since the early 1980s, before the original free trade agreement was even signed. Let that sink in. The U.S. administration assumes we are desperate to return to the way things were. They do not understand the mechanics of global trade. Once supply chains are rerouted, once new logistics networks are established, once trust is forged with new partners in the Indo-Pacific or Europe, those trade routes do not simply snap back because Washington suddenly decides it wants our aluminum again. This isn't a temporary dip in trade volume. It is the permanent rerouting of the global supply chain away from American ports and American control. Canada is securing its own future, insulating our universal healthcare system from the predatory pricing demands of U.S. pharmaceutical lobbies that always accompany American trade pressure, and ensuring that our strategic resources serve Canadian interests first. We are building a fortress economy, not by building walls, but by building bridges to the rest of the world. But to truly understand the sheer magnitude of this geopolitical masterstroke, we have to look beneath the surface of traditional trade and focus on the bedrock of the 21st century economy: critical minerals and Arctic sovereignty. This is where the Canadian strategy moves from defensive maneuvering to absolute, unassailable leverage. While Washington has been busy playing a loud 20th century game of tariff whack-a-mole over standard consumer goods and auto parts, Prime Minister Carney has been quietly securing the chessboard for the next 50 years. The U.S. administration, in its myopic obsession with short-term political optics, fundamentally ignored the reality of modern industrial warfare. The future of advanced manufacturing, whether it is the lithium required for next-generation electric vehicle batteries, the cobalt necessary for advanced energy grids, or the rare earth elements that literally power the guidance systems of American F-35 fighter jets, lies buried beneath the Canadian shield. For decades, Washington simply assumed that when the time came, they would have unimpeded, cut-rate access to these resources. They viewed the Canadian North as their own strategic reserve, a safety deposit box they could open whenever the rivalry with Beijing or Moscow got too hot. But the moment the White House weaponized the border with 45% tariffs, Carney turned the key and locked that vault. He didn't cut off supply in a theatrical embargo. That would be too loud, too American in its execution. Instead, he systematically diversified the off-takers. Through a series of brilliant, under-the-radar bilateral agreements, Canada has begun funneling long-term critical mineral contracts to South Korea, Japan, and the European Union. We are building secure, closed-loop supply chains with nations that respect international law and honor their commitments. We are effectively telling Washington, if you want to tax our aluminum to death, you will find yourselves standing at the back of the line when it comes to the lithium and cobalt required to run your high-tech economy. This shift in resource control is massive. Do you think Washington has permanently lost its privileged access to Canadian resources, or will they eventually come back to the table on our terms? Share your thoughts in the comments. And this extends directly into the frozen frontier of the Arctic. As global trade routes shift, the Northwest Passage is becoming one of the most vital strategic waterways on the planet. Historically, American administrations have arrogantly challenged Canadian sovereignty over these waters, treating our Arctic archipelago as an international toll-free highway. In the past, Canadian leaders might have issued polite diplomatic protests. Not anymore. Seizing the momentum of this economic decoupling, the Carney administration has initiated a massive historic modernization of our northern defense capabilities. We are deploying advanced surveillance drones, deep-water acoustic arrays, and reinforcing our northern naval presence, not in partnership with a hostile Washington, but in lockstep with our NATO allies in Scandinavia. We are establishing facts on the ground and in the ice. This is the ultimate realization of the elbows-up doctrine. It is a calculated demonstration that Canada is not just a polite neighbor with trees and water. We are the gatekeepers to the resources and trade routes that will define global supremacy in the coming decades. By alienating us over petty, short-sighted tariff disputes, the U.S. administration hasn't just hurt their domestic auto workers. They have actively jeopardized their own national security and their competitive edge in the global technology race. They threw away the keys to the 21st century just to win a news cycle. And Canada, calmly and without hesitation, picked those keys up and walked away. So where does this leave us as we look down the road? Well, the gravity of what we've achieved is about to be put to the ultimate test. Come July 2026, the big North American trade agreement, the USMCA, is up for a mandatory joint review. The U.S. administration undoubtedly planned to use this review as a moment of maximum leverage, a time to extract further concessions from a battered and compliant Canada. They will find a very different country waiting for them at the negotiating table. Canada enters this critical juncture not from a place of panic, but from an unprecedented position of fortified strength. By diversifying our trade portfolios, by proving we can absorb the shock of a 45% tariff and pivot globally, and by maintaining absolute sovereign control over the critical minerals the U.S. desperately needs for its future survival, Canada holds the leverage. We do not need to beg for market access. We do not need to compromise our healthcare system or our environmental standards to appease a transactional administration in Washington. We have proven that we have options. The United States administration fundamentally misunderstood what makes this country strong. They looked at our politeness and mistook it for weakness. They looked at our deeply held belief in the rule of law and mistook it for a lack of resolve. They thought that because we do not beat our chests or wrap ourselves in flag-draped nationalism, we lacked the spine to defend our vital interests. They were wrong. We do not win through sheer volume. We do not win through aggressive posturing or emotional tantrums. We win through endurance. We win through superior intellect, unshakable preparation, and an unwavering, quiet commitment to the sovereignty of this nation. Canada has demonstrated to the world, and more importantly, to ourselves, that it is entirely possible to stare down the massive engine of American economic aggression, refuse to blink, and emerge not just intact, but stronger, more independent, and more respected on the world stage than ever before. The era of catching their cold is over. We are masters in our own home, and our future, finally and irrevocably, belongs to us. Friends, if this breakdown of the real geopolitical chessboard made sense to you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, tell me in the comments, how do you see the 2026 USMCA review playing out? Are we ready for the showdown? Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.